Assalamu alaikum and good day everyone. I am Nur Hamida Sultan Guru and I'm going to discuss the strategies in teaching literature. So last meeting, the reporters discussed about the challenges encountered in teaching literature. So in my report, I'm going to cite some strategies in teaching literature, particularly in teaching poetry. So I have this found study entitled Approaches Adapted in the Teaching of Poetry for the Upper Secondary School Students in Tawau Town Area. So the author of this study were Bridget Lim Sukhan and Suhaida Omar. So this study was conducted in Malaysia. So the main aim of conducting this study was to investigate the various techniques adopted among the teachers teaching poetry in the upper secondary schools in the Tawau town area. So the researcher would like to find out the types of techniques that are preferred the most as well as the list in the teaching of poetry to the upper secondary school students and examine the factors that affect the selection of these techniques. English is an extremely influential language in Malaysia, and the Ministry of Education is striving hard to make English more accessible to the students so that they are not only able to engage in meaningful information exchange for local and international trade and commerce, as well as technological transfer, but also be more open-minded and sensitive to human values and conditions. So the teaching and learning of the English language at the secondary school level is encountering some problems which may thwart the internalization of this target language among the learners. One of the problems involves the detachment in the teaching process. There is less engagement or involvement demonstrated in the teaching and learning process, especially on the part of the students. Apart from that, some teachers still prefer the traditional and teacher-centered approach to the communicative approach when presenting the language to the learners. Okay, so let's proceed to the aim and objectives of this paper. So the main aim of conducting this study is to investigate the various techniques adopted among the teachers teaching poetry in the upper secondary schools in Tawau town area, and it serves as a preliminary study to tap into the preferences of the English language teachers in Tawau town area in poetry teaching. So there are several objectives to be looked into this paper. So in this study, the researcher would like to first find out the types of techniques that are preferred most as well as list in the teaching of poetry to the upper secondary school students, and second, examine the factors that affect the selection of these techniques. So as for research methodology, so in this study, a survey research which is adapted from Davidson 1970 is adopted. So self-completion questionnaires, interviews, and classroom observation are the main data gathering methods in order to collect information based on the research question formulated for this study. So the targeted sample of this project consists of 45 English language teachers teaching literature component to secondary 4 and 5 students from 7 secondary schools which are located within a 5-kilometer radius of Tawau town area. So as for data collection and analysis, so the data collected from the questionnaires is computed using SPSS version 12.0. So the main and mood of various approaches and techniques used in teaching of poetry are calculated. So as for classroom observation, a structured observation schedule is adapted to identify various techniques used in poetry lesson. A 3-point scale is available for each of the technique for the researchers to assess how well a teacher has carried out a specific poetry teaching technique in the classroom. So interview is also conducted with the heads of department from the 7 schools in this study So head of department is the best person to get access and information pertaining to the English language teachers' teaching preferences and the plausible problems encountered by them. So key points based on the interview schedule are gathered and analyzed, and this information is utilized to discuss the research questions in this study. Okay, so let's proceed to the presentation of findings and discussion. So discussion on the research questions formulated is put forward. Then practical recommendations are suggested so that the teaching of poetry would be a fruitful experience for the teachers teaching English to students of upper secondary school level, especially in Tawau town area. So we have here two questions. First, which are the techniques and approaches that are highly preferred in the teaching of poetry among the teacher for the upper secondary school level in Tawau town area, and why? So, through the data collected using questionnaires, moral philosophical approach is the approach most preferred. So this is due to the fact that discussing the values and the underlying issues in the poetry selected is a compulsory stage because they are going to be tested in the examinations. The teachers need to expose the students to the values and issues, either explicitly or implicitly, so that they would be able to give appropriate responses to those questions of this nature. Information-based approach is not too popular among the targeted sample of this research, except the technique of exploring the characters, settings, or objects referred to the poetic text. Identifying the characters, setting, and object in the poems are essential because this would not only help the students to create better mental picture for them to internalize the content and meaning intended in the poems, but also assist them in answering their examination questions on poetry better. So the second question is, which are the techniques and approaches that are preferred least in teaching of poetry among the teachers for the upper secondary school level in Tawau town area, and why? So a stylistic approach is the approach that the teachers preferred least in this study. Since the linguistic devices involved are not tested in the examinations, the teacher prefer not to bring the students through the process of analyzing them, especially for those who are low in their proficiency. So these devices are not common in their English language classrooms. Therefore, exposing them to these students may further confuse them in the learning of poetry. So in addition, one common that trend could be identified through the data collected using questionnaires and interview protocols is that dramatic activities, which is a technique advocated under the language-based approach, is not favored by teachers to teach poetry in the classroom. So the notion of preparing students for dramatic activities is favorable by one of these teachers. This is because dramatic activities are not commonly used for everyday English language lessons by some of these teachers. So the implementation of these activities may demand teachers extra time and effort. Okay, so here are the approaches and techniques to literature or poetry teaching that I found in the study. So there are different types of approaches that can be adapted in the teaching of literature. So we have here 5 approaches in the teaching of literature in ASL or AFL classroom, which are commonly adopted, have been selected to be investigated in this study. So they are: first, information-based approach. So the teaching methodologies involved aim to expose learners to facts and information about a target country, culture, and even the writer of the literary text. So this approach is very teacher-centered. They aim to teach and concentrate in areas such as history and characteristics of literary movements, the social and historical background to a text, the biography of the author and its relevance to his or her writings, literary genres and rhetorical devices, and etc. And the second one is personal response-based approach. So according to Carter 1987, they are more student-centered, focusing on an elicitation of individual response in terms of experience, feelings, and opinions to a text. They are excellent stimuli for group work that can help students to become actively involved both intellectually and emotionally by associating the themes and topics portrayed in the literary text with the student's personal experience, and some of the techniques manifested under this approach are brainstorming, class discussion, group work, and free expression of feelings, expression, and opinion. So the third approach is a language-based approach. So this approach encourages techniques which are learner-centered, activity-based, and gives particular attention to the way language is manipulated. So some of the standard, widely used and widely known techniques of this approach are language activities, rewriting and creative writing, dramatic activities, and reading aloud. And the fourth approach is stylistics approach. So according to Leach and Short, 1981, stylistics approach uses the apparatus of linguistic description, for example, special stylistic choices and patterns as well as metalinguistic items to analyze how meanings in a context are communicated. Widowson 1975 suggests that learners need to be alerted to deviation from standard English and that this is best achieved through the comparison of literary discourse with instances of conventional writing. Apart from that, Bach 1993 advocates the benefits of alerting students to the stylistic choices and the patterning of feature in the text, and then encourage them to explore the effect of these choices on the meaning. And the last approach is moral philosophical approach. Moral philosophical approach adapted in poetry teaching enables teacher to lead learners in discussing the existence of moral values discernible in a text. So according to Record 1995, teachers who guide learners read and interpret literary works under moral philosophical approach may help learners to reach self-understanding and self-realization. Apart from that, the task of interpretation of literary text may further assist learners to explore how the text projects and manifests the world we inhabit. Okay, so for the conclusion of the study, through this simple study, the researcher is able to gain insights on teachers' preferences in using poetry in their teaching, the approaches and techniques they prefer most as well as list in teaching of poetry and factors involved in the selection of approaches and techniques in poetry teaching. It hoped that the information obtained can be used by the researcher and her colleagues in the teacher training college to propose and subsequently design practical suggestions on how to improve the teaching processes using poetry. And that would be all in my part. Thank you for listening.